Good morning to you on this wonderful 20th day of December as we head to the high days. It's a Friday morning, and if you've joined us, then we are live on the fifth connection. Theo is not joining me this morning, but we are going to continue right along in our series through the story that unfolds in a sermon that actually is an epistle. It's a letter, but it's a slice of reality that we are going to look at to orient our own minds, to orient our lives to the reality and the realities that we face. So we've just moved through the introduction to the book of Hebrews. And remember, the book of Hebrews is written to Hebrews that they no longer remain Hebrews. And I suggested to you that this is no small thing. To walk away from a cultural identity, to walk away from that which gives us grounding, that roots us, that provides us with stability, provides us with a sense of security. The challenge is to walk away from that, because this can so easily become an egoic attachment, something that Paul addresses in the book of Philippians. In that story, he talks about, even though he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, he counted that but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus. He says, my Lord, for whom I have counted all things but loss, that I may gain him and be found in him, and not having a righteousness of my own, but a righteousness which is by faith of Christ. And so here in the book of Hebrews, the challenge is to defy the odds. That's what the 13 chapters are all about, defying the odds, going against the odds, because pressing on, moving on is so crucial. Stagnation is a dangerous thing. Press on, because pressing on will prevent sliding back. Pressing on would prevent sliding back and becoming old and stale with no freshness, no curiosity, no creativity. I'm sure you've met enough of those across your lifetime. And maybe you are in a situation where you've lost your freshness and your excitement and your curiosity for God and the things of God. Well, here's a book that will rock your world, because as I walked through the introduction to this sermon, that is a letter to Hebrew people, Hebrew Christians. Remember, the word Hebrew is a word used in reference to the people of God as Abram journeys from Ur of the Chaldees, and he crosses that great river, right? He came across Ever. It's the word from which we get the word Hebrew, the people who crossed the river, the great river, and came into the promised land. And these are the people that Paul is addressing. They are believers. They have embraced Christ. And he's going to walk through this book in a very interesting way. Remember, this book is written to Jews in a very interesting spiritual condition. There's persecution that has broken out. And in all likelihood, the book has been written just before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So from 60 to 70, I would suggest more specifically 68 to 69, the sacrifices are still in place, as Hebrews talks about it. And so Jerusalem hasn't fallen yet. And so the letter is addressed to Hebrew believers and also whom we do not know. What we do know is that he's a Hebrew. He is Jewish. Remember, the Jewish nomenclature was tied to this people group by outsiders. The Jews were insiders. They had a hotline to God. They were the elect of God. They were chosen for a purpose that God had designed for them. So they were the elect. That doesn't mean they were automatically saved. Don't make a direct link between election and salvation. That's not how the word is used in the Old Testament. God chooses this people group because they would be the channel for salvation. So the author is Jewish, and we pick that up through the knowledge of the writer of Jewish culture, a very deep understanding of who they are. And so in the first 4 verses, watch what happens. The writer goes at addressing issues pertaining to maturing in the things of God for Hebrews, for Hebrew peoples. Because you see, in our culture today, we are very enamored with royalty, aren't we? We always think of how privileged people of royalty are. There are at least 29 monarchies around the world. For us as South Africans, we come out of that British royal culture. It's amazing how British we are. If you've ever trucked around the British Isles, you will know what I'm talking about. The landscapes look very much like what we have. Many of the homes right here in the bay, across Cape Town, are a reminder of the colonial eras that we come out of. But what is not so fascinating, and it may be for some, are the fair share of scandals that royal families have. Struck by scandals, particularly with members of the family who have children out of wedlock. So I came across this title of an article that says, all the royals with rumored, and I quote, rumored illegitimate children. Because you see, relationships are messy and life is messy. And many of the males have engaged in relationships and had children outside of what we would call their legitimate families. I think of one in particular, Prince Albert II of Monaco. What makes him quite interesting is that he had a romance with a flight attendant named Nicole Costa. And that relationship lasted some 6 years. And she gave birth to his second illegitimate child, Alexandra Grimaldi Costa. The prince used to be very hands-on with his son, his only son, but since he married his wife, and she incidentally was South African born, it was Princess Charlene. He married her in 2011, and since he's become more distant from that only son of his. You see, there are always challenges that rise around whether a son is a legitimate heir or not. Is he heir to the throne? If he's illegitimate, does that still make him a legitimate heir? But when we come to the book of Hebrews, we see that there is a son who is eligible as the co-inheritor and claimant of the name. The text is going to explain what claiming the name is all about for this son. And what the writer does so carefully is he does not dive into explaining to us all the details of who Jesus is right in verse number 1. It doesn't say this son is God. It doesn't say his name is Jesus, but he is going to explain who this son is. It is a son, because this son is eligible as the co-inheritor and claimant of the name. And so the first 4 verses of chapter 1 answers the question. And what is the question? How is this son eligible to inherit and claim the name? How is this son eligible to inherit and claim the name? And we know from our own families how families can fight over claiming inheritances. We feel it's our right. We are the legitimate heirs. Because of my surname, I am a legitimate heir and I can demand what is mine. Legitimately so. And so we see that the writer starts out in this book. He talks about in verse number 1, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. Now, I just read through 2 verses of that storyline, and it is jam-packed. It is chock full of information about who this person is. Now, again, notice that the writer doesn't dive in and say, this is Jesus. This is the embodied incarnate Christ, the Messiah. It doesn't go there. He starts out very, very slowly and emphatically and says that in time past, God spoke in a fragmented way at many times, right? He spoke incrementally and he spoke partially at many times and in many ways. Not that there was anything wrong with him, but the revelation we have in the scriptures is an unfolding one. It wasn't dropped from the heavens in a mechanical, dictated kind of way, the way some traditions claim that their religious books have been written. Scriptures was unfolded over a long period of time, and the word was compiled over about 1400 years by 40 different authors. So at many times and in many ways, it was fragmentary and it was partial. But God spoke to our fathers, this writer says, our fathers. Whose fathers? The Hebrew people, what we would call the Israelites. Of course, Israel was the name that God gave to Jacob because Jacob was a wrestler. The nocturnal wrestling match between he and this angel puts his hip out of joint. And that's where he gets the name Israel, Prince of God, or he who strives with God. God spoke to our fathers, the writer says, by the prophets, by these spokespersons. The prophets were covenant enforcers. But in these last days, from the time of his resurrection all the way through to his coming, his second coming, but in these last days he has spoken. He has not been silent. He is there. He is not silent. He has spoken to us by his Son. He has spoken to us in his Son. Now, this is very, very significant because the text does not say in the original ancient language that God has spoken to us in his. The word his doesn't appear, nor does the word the appear. Some texts have spoken, he has spoken to us by the Son. Some say his Son. The writer is unfolding the identity of this channel, this vehicle, this person that he is speaking through. It's a son. That's all we know from verse 2. A son. the word is capitalized in the ESV and probably KJV as well. He has spoken to us in a son. Now, please note that son of God and sons of God was a very familiar term across the Old Testament. Sons of God appears first in Genesis 6. And then Israel is described in the book of Exodus as the son of God, the sons of God, right? Believers are described as sons of God. Now, beloved, we are the sons of God, and it does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know then that when he shall appear, we shall be like him. We are sons of God. John 1:12, but as many as received him, to them he gives the right to be called sons of God, children of God. So here is a son of God. This is a divine being. And this son of God is one who has been appointed the eligible heir, the legitimate heir of all things. He's appointed heir of all things, through whom also he created the world, the universe, all things. Now, this is so important because the writer doesn't say, this is Jesus and he's God. The writer knows his audience. And he knows how that Jewish people would struggle with this idea that if he said Jesus, the Son of God, they immediately would struggle with that. Does God have a son? In Islam, there's that struggle. How can God have a son? Does God beget a child the way a woman begets a child? And so, even though these are believers, the writer goes at it in a very interesting way and shows us that when we engage with people, we must be sensitive to where the audience is at. And that's why I think apologetics has things the wrong way around. We need to be taught right within the context of the believing community as we engage around the scriptures, as we buy into an infiltration edification model, an Ephesians 4 kind of model, a 1 Corinthians 11 to 14 kind of edification model, where the body is edifying itself, where all members of this body are engaging around the biblical text in little cells, in home groups. Can't do that with 3,000 people on a Sunday morning. But they are engaging in a model of edification around the biblical text because they are pursuing truth together. And that's where we need to be taught how to go at relationships and how to go at issues, to be sensitive to where we are at and who we are talking to. So this is a son, and this son is an appointed heir. He's the co-heir of all things. He's an eligible heir, and he is the creator, the co-creator of the world. And so we're going to stop right there this morning as we consider why, and continue to consider, why is this son the eligible heir? And you have to hold your breath here because he's going to go through some very interesting teaching about who this son is. He's not an illegitimate heir, he's a legitimate heir. We are heirs of the Father, we are joint heirs with Christ, we are heirs of the Son, we are children of the kingdom, we are family. Yes, we are one. And so this morning I'm going to sign out on that note and encourage you to have a wonderful day. Enjoy the Lord, and thank you for listening.